much. So W. Montague Cobb was the chair of anatomy at Howard University and the only Black anthropologist in the United States until the time of the Korean War. He recognized how studies that tried to analyze performance only in terms of physiology could be reductive, and use his medical acumen to try and demonstrate these inadequacies. So really, it was no surprise that I came across him in my own work and reading. You see, I had determined to try to study racial health disparities in lung disease. The tool I had at my disposal was spiromics, a multi-center observational longitudinal cohort of smokers with an at-risk for COPD. Now, there was fair representation of Black participants, about 20% of the overall cohort. And as a group, they were overall younger, more likely to have asthma, certainly more symptomatic, and less privileged by the available metrics of socioeconomic status as compared to our non-Hispanic white participants. Perhaps strangely though, when we use the current approach of race-specific reference equations, they had statistically identical and even a higher, you see, point reference here of their lung function though. And so this is what we were trying to study. The next 20 minutes, I'd like to spend some time speaking with you about the analyses that my co-authors and mentors helped me to leverage from this data set. But as importantly, about an earlier iteration of the same approach written about 90 years earlier in a study asking many of the same kinds of questions as my own. Of Dr. Cobb's many studies that he did, one of the most famous was his work in track and field. He was trying to understand whether the success of Black athletes was due to an innate anatomic or physiological advantage. And so here you see him as a young man, literally measuring the size of Olympian Jesse Owens' muscles. But he ran into this problem as he began to talk to expert commentators and star athletes and coaches and said, well, what makes a good runner? He said that almost at once he was beset with vagaries. People began to admit that, they couldn't really explain how this process worked. And the more I learned about lung function, the more I could relate to this sentiment. As we all know, the correlation between symptom burden and lung function as reported by percent predicted FEV1 is shockingly poor in COPD, so much so as to earn specific reference from the GOLD guidelines and require this ABCD system for our medications. The latest iteration of the lung allocation score has removed spirometry altogether, finding that things like evidence of right heart failure and supplemental oxygen usage are more reliable. And even in asthma, where it was not so much a part of ongoing management as initial staging, its importance is declining even further. And what we have to ask is whether these difficulties may not be related to a systemic error that we have introduced by using race in trying to measure lung function. So we know that the race-specific system emerged from studies of asymptomatic individuals that showed there were racial differences. And the idea was you don't want to penalize someone for a difference that might be inconsequential. But there's an error there in that it does more than allow for a difference to be inconsequential. It in fact requires it. And that means we really need to know what is behind the meaning of these racial differences. If it was all innate, that would be fine. But as we can see from this directed acyclic graph, there's actually many opportunities for socially imposed inequities to be incorporated into your measurements now and then normalized by a race-specific equation. So is this happening or not? We need to understand what is the cause of these racial differences in lung function to answer that. So a very common explanation you might have heard is that, well, this is about body proportion. Because people with African ancestry, as the argument goes, tend to have longer limbs relative to their trunk, that of course their chest and lung size is going to be proportionally smaller to a non-Hispanic white of the same exact height. And so, yes, if I use standing height as a determinant in a reference equation, I'm always going to get that African Americans are now having lower quote unquote lung function. But what happens when we actually try to test this hypothesis, which does sound very reasonable, I'll admit. So the Cardia investigators tried to do exactly that. They said, well, what if we just try to be really precise about measuring frame size, not just standing height, but sitting height, leg height, elbow breadth by acromial diameter, which has been used to measure the skeletal proportion and kind of offset obesity. And what they found is actually that only accounted for about 22% of the differences between non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. So it would be very odd if the big explanation is something that actually explains less than a quarter of the data. But thankfully, there are a lot better approaches out there. This on the left side is, of course, that very famous graph from the Kumar paper talking about the role of continental ancestry in predicting lung function. This, I want you to appreciate, is only the first in a whole series of papers by the same research group that has done really strong work. They are a notable and thankful exception to the 94% of manuscripts on this topic that don't reference social context at all. That is to say, they did incorporate these kind of metrics into their analyses. And so even just accepting without contestation at all, their measure of about negative 308 milliliters contribution of that can be attributed to African ancestry in the average Black or African American person in the United States. We see that when we look at the overall size of the racial difference in lung function, again, taking from Cardia, that is still even trying to be as generous as possible. So we've separated out the anthropometric contribution and the ancestral, even though these probably have some overlap, and the anthropometric is probably largely the way that the ancestral is mediated. But even if we treat them completely separately, we still have almost 35% of this racial difference that we don't know what is going on and why this is. And so we can't say whether it's truly benign or not. So given this difficulty and these ongoing vagaries, as Dr. Cobb would say, I wanted to try a different approach. I said, well, rather than trying to make assumptions about what this is, let's just say, what is the best way to present it? What correlates with symptoms better? Should we use a race-specific approach that, again, requires that every single milliliter of difference between African Americans and non-Hispanic whites on average is completely benign? Or should we use a universally applied multi-ethnic equation like the GLI other that doesn't make any specific hypotheses about why these differences exist or what their impact is clinically? And if we believe that truly in the one human race, there should be a constant relationship between lung function and symptoms, I'll point out that it is the GLI other, that multi-ethnic universally applied equation, that gets us there, not the race-specific approach. But I wanted to be more robust than that. I wanted to incorporate more outcomes than just symptom scores. I wanted radiographic measures like airway wall thickness and present emphysema, functional measures like 6-minute walk test. And I also wanted to understand not just the performance in one data set, but what it would look like in many different data sets, of course. And so for all these, I use Alpayton's 5x2 F test, which is an expansion of the cross-fold validation technique that gives me a meaningful test statistic and better handles the data. What I found is, again, in 5 of 6 outcomes studied, the multi-ethnic universally applied approach was superior. This is not just about lowering the numbers for the African Americans where there's disparity. We can see for 6-minute walk in FVC, even though we lower the numbers, it doesn't perform better, so that's not true. We also know for non-Hispanic white, it lowered the numbers more than the GLI other, yet there's many cases like the airway wall thickness PI10 or the 6-minute walk distance for FEV1, where the GLI other outperformed the non-Hispanic and white universal application, even though it didn't lower the numbers as much. So that's not something so simple as going on. But it does say that there is something weird happening. Maybe these are not all benign changes. So what else could be going on? Well, Dr. Cobb, after he had demonstrated the inadequacy of racialized approaches, he highlighted one piece of analysis that had been missing: social context. And so when I looked at what in his parlance was experience and better nurture, I found a lot of evidence for influence on lung function. Take, for instance, a study by Massey and Massey on Japanese Americans in Hawaii. Now, this was 108 individuals, 59 male and 59 female, all of whom had 4 Japanese grandparents. But those that had spent their childhood primarily in the islands of Japan had a lung function that fit very well into the Japanese reference equations. Whereas those who had spent their childhood in Hawaii in the United States had lung function that matched very well with the non-Hispanic white equations that were being developed in America at the time. So very hard to explain if lung function is solely an innate or ancestral or what have you thing that's not influenced by environment. And we see this same phenomenon when we look in China and examine the physical and economic changes brought about by Deng Xiaoping's reform after 1978. Now, connected to that access to the global marketplace, there was a gradient in this growth that happened both north to south and east to west. So cities that are very affluent, like Beijing in the northeast, they have some of the tallest height people now, as shown by this study by Yang Zhu. Whereas you look at places that are in the south and east, like Guizhou, and they have the shortest people and the poorest people also, coincidentally, right? Now, if we go a little bit further, we could see that Ashizawa's study in 2008 in anthropological research also shows that even the way their height grew over these decades since 1978 in Beijing, those children, they didn't just get taller, their leg height stayed the same. So they're actually changing that trunk to limb ratio that was supposed to be so, sacred and racially determined. So an interesting note, but we'll just say that their lung function also grew as their height grew and their wealth grew. And now the smallest gaps to non-Hispanic whites are in these north air regions like Hebei, and they are greatest in these southern regions like Guizhou, again, which lines up perfectly with the changes in wealth in that country. So I try to do the same thing in my cohort in spiromics, looking at what is the effect of privilege with a composite metric of 5 equally mated social and environmental exposures. Now, for non-Hispanic whites, absolutely, I saw that. The more privilege they had, the better their lung function was. But there was no influence of this at all that I could appreciate in African Americans. And so then the question became, is that a reasonable hypothesis to say that, well, privilege somehow doesn't work the same for one group of people as it does for another race of people? So first, I got to point you out that this is a very old theory, right? This is Ida B. Wells. She was a major anti-lynching advocate. She did 2 things of note I want to tell you about. First of all, when she actually just counted and tested the assumptions of racist people that we're talking about, well, lynching is really about, sexual crimes and things like that. That was actually the extreme minority of all the lynchings on record. So again, their theory didn't even stand up despite being the most talked. And then number 2, she described in vivid detail the implementation of a system of laws and practices that disadvantage Black people, some of which have been dismantled and some of which have not. I want to show you this study from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is a meta-analysis of job callbacks and for applications for job. They took identical CVs and resumes, changed only the name to make one slightly more African-American or Black sounding, one more typically Caucasian, whether these were flamboyant and different or whether they were subtle differences, like just the last name frequencies. Something to indicate that you were Black meant you were much less likely, 1.5 times less likely to get called back or go on to the next step of a job hiring process. And so now you say, well, okay, this exists somewhere in the society, but does this apply to health outcomes? So I want to show you this study from Kothari looking at low birth weight pregnancies in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Now, it's sad but unsurprising that worse outcomes cluster with poverty and with non-white race. But our interesting thing here is that while increasing wealth and privilege and affluence benefited the non-Hispanic white participants, just like in our study, we saw that there was no benefit for Black participants. In fact, the very worst thing you could be was a Black mother in a predominantly white milieu. Whereas if you were in a Black affluent neighborhood, you had just as good of outcomes as anyone. Now, what I'm not advocating for here is segregation, but I am saying that maybe there was something about this experience those mothers were having in the white neighborhoods that could have been related to this difference, right? So Dr. Cobb, as he was concluding his article on runners, he said that if racialized theories were true, the pretty short Asian man that had just captured a championship was exactly what ought not be. And we've been talking today about things that ought not be. Irregularities in the dogma about lung function and race, inconsistencies in the promise of a just nation and the realities in which we live. This great man, who had been a friend and co-worker of the founders of the NAACP, who led the fight to open hospital privileges to non-white physicians, who coordinated the medical response in support of the Selma March protesters. He was inspired to join science because he wanted to see the separate dignity of races. But after he studied the outcomes that really mattered, he came to see that race-specific approaches didn't really have any value at all. He focused on experience. And that's what I want us to focus on. It's really easy to put a Black Lives Matter sticker on your car's bumper. But have we sat down and wrestled with why the retention rate for URM trainees has historically been so poor? We can all find something pink to wear for Women's History Month in March, and then pull it back out again for Susan G. Komen in October. But we in this very interventional specialty, have we done something to reform a system that our own colleagues have shown produced shocking disparities in procedural training across gender? Everybody's getting advanced degrees if you're at this conference, but has anyone looked into the marginalized experience and tried to take on the fellowship of their suffering? My name is Aaron Dorian Baugh. My earliest ancestors toiled as slaves on the shores of Maryland. I now stand, though, on the shoulders of giants, for which I am thankful, both in this generation and in the one that came before. I thank you so much for your time and your attention and support, and I will take questions at this time.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name too. My apology there. So this is, I'm looking to see if anybody has risen hands with any questions.
Maybe I have a quick question, Mehrdad. I wonder, Aaron, so good and so great to hear a passionate talk from a young scientist in our group. Thanks so much for doing that way. I think it's very good for us to hear that. When you talk about experience, are the study instruments good for that? Can we measure this properly? You didn't really talk about that. I worry that the instruments are not that good.
Yeah, excellent question. So I think these instruments could certainly be better. For instance, a lot of studies for reasons of convenience will use geocoding. We know now that this is not the best way to do spatial analysis and evidence-based analysis of neighborhood quality, but it is for many years it was the best we had. We're developing new techniques, and I think the only way we will be able to continue to refine and improve on these techniques is to really invest in it. I referenced earlier that, over 90% of the older manuscripts that looked at these questions didn't look at, these social differences at all. And until we start having more investigators that do so, we're not going to be able to develop the better techniques that we need to really get at these answers in a high quality fashion.
Aaron, I have actually a question. I think it's very interesting because there are data from, for example, Mexico City, Isabel Romeo. They did a very interesting study, measured spirometry in school children every 3 months for over a period of 3 years. And they could just show that the rate of the lung growth actually was related to the ozone levels at each neighborhood. And so essentially, people could be considered to be normal, or in whatever normal is, but the lung growth could be affected, as you kind of very nicely mentioned, but many different social issues. That's air pollution, but it could be also nutritional or many other factors involved. And so just trying to kind of, even within the same potential race and ethnicity, trying to figure out what is a range could be actually very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Ashish Agrawal, who writes on this topic in India, talks about something he calls the so-called normal, right? That the real question that we want to get to as pulmonologists in the long term is, not just whether, someone has disease or not, but is someone achieving the true potential of their lung function? And that almost becomes a personalized medicine question, and is more in line with what you're asking, right? That even if a person lands in a range that might be normal, are they being adversely affected by the pollution in their neighborhood, by the allostatic load and the stress of, poverty or violence that is in that neighborhood? Are they malnourished in some way, or the unequal access to healthcare? And I think those are the long game, and that is an important policy question for all of us to consider, not just, does a person have disease or not, but what are the interventions that can maximize the pulmonary health of our entire population?
Thank you. John, go ahead, please.
Yes, Aaron, great talk. I was just, and you just kind of got to where I was going, but in your response to John Fahey, you talked about how we need better instruments to measure neighborhood quality on multiple levels, and I totally agree. But there's an individual level component as well that we also need to measure better. There's a fair amount of evidence, as you know, that experiencing racial discrimination on the individual level has biological effects. You mentioned allostatic load, and that's sort of the most common way that that's looked at. But my personal feeling, knowing the literature somewhat, is that the environmental stressors are important. Of course, I study air pollution, but there are also individual psychosocial effects of living as a person of color in a racist society.
Absolutely. I want to 100% endorse that and say I agree with it. I'll note that in spiromics, we didn't get a lot of chance to talk about it just because of our limited time, but the majority of the metrics we used for the adversity opportunity index were in fact individual level. So certainly I agree that those are important. And also I will agree with you that I think there is a specific adverse effect to discrimination and being in a society that where you are marginalized, right? And those are both psychological and physiological. So I certainly want to agree with that.